The American military buildup against Iran keeps increasing. Everything indicates that significantly more extensive military actions are being planned than initially expected. The signs suggest that they may be able to begin in the second half of this week. Meanwhile, more and more information is coming out of Iran about the massacre that took place there. The scale that is now being talked about is 30,000 or more dead in just 2 days. That would be one of the largest massacres in our lifetime. All this and more in this situation report.
Holy moly! Now save the most with my code at Holy.
The New York Times writes that Ali Khamenei instructed the National Security Council on January 9th to suppress the protests with all necessary force. Government forces were ordered to shoot, to kill, and show no mercy. On January 22nd, a government statement from Iran announced that there had been 3,117 deaths. That means the government itself admitted that several thousand people were killed. According to the Iranian government, 2,427 of them were security personnel and innocent civilians, and the rest, according to them, were terrorists. Opposition media, on the other hand, report that family members of victims had to sign a statement saying the victim was a Basiji member in order to even receive the body. In this example here, it is said that 1 billion rials was demanded if the family wanted to have the body of the deceased returned. If they wanted it for free, they had to sign that the deceased was a member of the Basij. They aimed to raise the reported number of security force deaths. And of course, to be able to support the narrative that they were fighting against terrorists and not against unarmed protesters. The president of Iran even says quite openly that doctors must be convinced to follow the government line so that they don't publish anything that could help the enemies. That is absolutely remarkable, because it clearly shows how the government is openly saying, we want to influence the external perception here, because the doctors are the ones who actually see who has been brought in, what kind of people have been injured and killed, and who are aware of what's happening. Whether, as has been reported, and for which there are many indications, injured people were abducted from the hospitals and then later killed. Doctors can report all of this firsthand. And at the same time, this of course allows for projections for the entire country. And here, the government wants to make sure that it keeps control of the narrative. The United Nations expert Maisato stated on the 19th in on January 19th, she said that there had been at least 5,000 deaths, while 20,000 would be credible. And now, there are reports here that the number could exceed 30,000. That means the expected death toll is enormous, based on what is being heard from Iran. There are also reports of executions of people who were arrested and have already been executed. We have examples here, where in the first case, a bodybuilder was arrested, we see him here, and was killed. And this is a former Iranian athlete who fled, who says that she received information from Iran that mass detainees are being kept in halls in Iran, taken out from there and executed. And then it is declared that they were killed during the crackdown. So what would that indicate? If this is true, which of course cannot be verified at this point, but if it is true, it could mean that the death toll might rise by many thousands. Here we have the Sunni cleric Maulana Abul Hamid, who is one of the most prominent Sunni clerics among the Shiites. He has openly criticized the government here and demanded the release of the prisoners and the restoration of the internet. And he also speaks about those thousands who were killed here in the recent protests. He can freely express criticism because he greatly influences the Sunnis, and arresting him could increase unrest. That's why he is one of those who speaks out relatively openly against the government, and the government allows him to do so. Normally, I like to make funny transitions to an ad on this channel, but with this topic, that would be a bit disrespectful, so we'll go straight to the ad.
When I researched the war in Ukraine,
Militaryland is a top site for this, but since they block Panama IPs, I need a VPN. With CyberGhost VPN, today's sponsor, I can access military lands securely and bypass geo-blocking on 40 streaming services, all without logs. With just 2 clicks, you can select one of the 100 countries that CyberGhost offers to unlock content blocked in your region. This also applies to the United Kingdom. That's why I can watch the British Broadcasting Corporation's outstanding documentaries. No logs are kept, so nobody can track the sites you visited. With CyberGhost, all your online activity is fully encrypted, so you basically enjoy complete privacy on the internet. With one subscription, I can connect 7 devices, like smart TVs and my phone, and share it with friends and family. The software is user-friendly and runs on all major platforms without technical skills needed. Support is available 24/7, including in German, if any problems occur. Thousands of 5-star Trustpilot reviews and over 38 million users speak for themselves. Use the link in the description to get 83% off and 4 free months, plus a 45-day money-back guarantee. There are now indications that the Atesh have also suffered losses. In this example, we see a death notice about a lieutenant colonel who was shot in Tehran on the 10th. According to the information here, that's the case. Based on his collar insignia, he was in an electronic warfare unit. How he died is currently unknown. On the same day, the commander of the Atesh also declared that they would protect the Islamic Republic of Iran. And on the 14th, then came the statement that they had defeated the conspiracy of the enemies. So, both expected statements that the Atesh would declare their loyalty to the government. That was to be expected. However, on the 8th, there were already reports on January 8th that there were refusals to follow orders and arrests of government forces. At that time, I was not able to verify this. We now have a state-run media outlet that on January 9th reported apparent cases of positions being abandoned, suggesting refusal to follow orders. And that suggests that this Israeli report could be true, according to which hundreds of members of the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij allegedly refused to take part or even defected. Because it must be clear that if only 3 or 4 people refused an order, it would hardly be mentioned in the media. That must point to a bigger problem. Meanwhile, the problems in Iran continue. In addition to water shortages and money shortages, Iran also has a gas shortage. That's how it is. In the Mazandaran province, public buildings and banks were closed to save gas. The date mentioned here is the 4th. February should be a mistranslation, since Iran uses the Islamic calendar. So, just to make sure there's no misunderstanding, this shows the country's problems persist. With no reforms, the government remains under pressure. At the same time, we have this news here from the Institute for Science and International Security, according to which the Iranians are working to protect the Parchin nuclear facility, specifically the Taliban 2 facility against airstrikes. If we scroll down, there are pictures there. This says a concrete bunker is being built over the facility, and piles of earth nearby, which can be seen here, piles of earth nearby, suggest that after a concrete sarcophagus is built over the facility, they want to cover it up in order to protect it from airstrikes. Tagalan 2 is important in that the facility is connected to the nuclear weapons program. Before 2003, explosive devices for the primary detonation of nuclear weapons were tested there. That is a very important step in the production of nuclear weapons. Besides acquiring the material, it's also about how you detonate it and the corresponding explosive devices that can lead to an implosion charge. These are necessary to make the warhead small enough to be mounted on cruise missiles and rockets, rather than being transported by a large bomber. And so what we're working on here is to harden the facility against shelling from the air, against air attacks. That suggests the nuclear program is being resumed, which of course makes an attack even more likely. According to Israeli media, the attack was delayed out of fear that there wasn't enough air and missile defense on site. These concerns are now being addressed with additional Patriot and Terminal High-Altitude Area defense batteries. In a few days, Israeli commentators and journalists here say there will be enough on site so that things could get started. However, we have indications that the weather in the United States has slowed down the deployment. Because of a snowstorm. In Fort Hood, for example, The 62nd Air Defense Artillery Regiment with Terminal High Altitude Area Defense is stationed, and from there were flights to the Middle East. But now there was a snowstorm in the eastern United States, which prevented flights from there. There are even indications here that it was visible that transport planes were diverted, which were on their way to Fort Hood and then landed at another airport along the way. And we now have open-source intelligence indicating that flights to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia are departing from Fort Hood. So it is to be expected that air defense systems will be relocated to the Arab states in the Gulf, especially to Kuwait and to Fort Hood. Transport planes are still heading to Diego Garcia. That is the military base in the Indian Ocean that is often used by the Americans for strategic bombers. If transport planes are flying there now, that would be an indication that they might be bringing ammunition there in order to use strategic bombers against Iran from that location. In addition, there are reports that the commander of CENTCOM, which is the responsible American command for an operation against Iran, he met with the chief of the Israeli armed forces. Clearly, a possible military operation against Iran is being personally coordinated in a conversation between the two. And by now, there are so many tankers in the region that the use of aircraft from Europe is also conceivable. So that significantly increases the number of available fighter jets, let's say. For example, in Great Britain, we have F-15Is, which already have a long range on their own, but at least theoretically could be deployed from Europe itself, from Great Britain. Against Iran, with sufficient aerial refueling, they could alternatively be quickly deployed, of course. Altogether, there are 42 United States tankers in Europe and the Middle East alone, so they will allow for supporting a large campaign. We're not even talking about the tankers of allied nations yet, which might not be able to participate in airstrikes, but could possibly help with refueling, for example, Saudi Arabia or Qatar. The United Arab Emirates have tanker aircraft, so it's at least conceivable that they could participate in refueling the American fighter jets. Also because the Americans, for example, helped the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates with their airstrikes in Yemen and refueled them. At the same time, however, the Foreign Ministry of the United Arab Emirates states that its territory would not be available for attacks, neither for overflights nor for the use of bases in the country. Here, it must be said that, of course, this is to be expected. It would be catastrophic for the United Arab Emirates, especially since they also want to shift their business model significantly towards tourism. If, for example, a hail of rockets were to rain down on Dubai and there were a number of hits, that would be a catastrophe for the entire business model. Because who would want to move to Dubai after that? If the skyscraper he's in could possibly be hit by an Iranian rocket? The Iranians are responding themselves. According to reports, Khamenei has already been taken underground and is no longer using any electronic devices. His third son has basically taken over the office for him temporarily and is carrying out his instructions. That would indicate that the Iranians are expecting an attack and see Khamenei as being at risk. The source here is Iran International, which is an opposition media outlet that does have good sources in the country, but for that reason, of course, should be viewed with some skepticism. At the same time, Iran declares that they will fully respond to any attack, not just with some kind of pro forma response that they would just sit out or something like that. At least before the military action begins, they declare that they will definitely respond with full force. Of course, you also have to see this in context, that it makes sense to make such threats for deterrence purposes, hoping that an American attack might then be smaller. Of course, in this context, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz should also be considered, which Iran is also threatening. That's nothing new either. However, if there were to be a larger military campaign, then that would definitely be expected if we want to summarize. To sum up, a United States military strike is actually certain. The likelihood that there will not be a United States military strike is now extremely low. Only an Iranian capitulation, meaning handing over those responsible, abandoning its nuclear and missile programs, and ending support for terrorist groups, could likely prevent it. But that is unlikely to happen. So it can be assumed that an American military strike will happen. The Iranian countermeasures, meaning how the Iranians will respond if they are attacked, will depend on whether Israel gets involved, because even Israel itself is not sure how far it actually wants to go. given the experiences from last year. If you listen to the polls and statements in Israel, it seems that a majority of the population is in favor of helping the Americans against Iran. They hope this will help liberate the Iranian population. But that doesn't mean the government will automatically get involved. However, if Iran were to fire its rockets at the Israelis, then of course Israeli intervention would be expected. So I'm adjusting my prediction accordingly, especially when we look at the fact that the United States military buildup is now much more than just for a pro forma attack and possible deterrence. Hence the change in my prediction. I now expect a longer campaign, not just a few attacks. And that, in turn, and this needs to be made clear, means that isolating the attacks to days when the stock market is closed will become impossible, and therefore attacks will no longer be limited to weekends. If we had assumed that there would be a single attack, then it would make sense to carry it out from Friday to Saturday night, to observe a possible Iranian counterstrike within the time frame before Monday. And if the whole situation doesn't escalate further, the stock markets would hardly react to it. But if we assume that there will be attacks for days, maybe even weeks, then of course it no longer makes sense to artificially aim for the weekend. Accordingly, it no longer depends on when the weekend is or when the attack begins. If we look at the current flight movements, an attack is probably not to be expected before Wednesday. But this week is absolutely realistic. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to start this week. However, it is highly likely. I don't see any realistic chance that this will end without a military strike. Accordingly, we should expect this to happen. As I said, the earliest possible time, in my opinion, is Wednesday. But we'll have to wait and see. It could definitely be delayed by another week or two. Of course, that's not certain. It's hard to predict. I had a competition I wanted to attend over the weekend, but I've canceled it now. This way, I can be ready to respond. So, at this point, if you don't want to miss anything, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss future videos. Once again, thanks to CyberGhost for supporting us with this ad. If you also want to browse the internet safely with a VPN, click the link in the description and get 83% off plus 4 months free. If you enjoyed it, please give a thumbs up to help the algorithm and leave a comment if you'd like. Thanks for your attention. Torsten Heinrich. See you soon. I'd also like to thank Patreon supporters and YouTube members. Special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Komp and Lieutenants Jans von Eck and Uwe Dufresne, Tubib, Karsten Schulz, Gulaschnasher 4000 Tequila, 42 Badass Lawyer, Matt, Brick, Robert Veal, Vision, Soundlab, Möter, Halbmensch, Halbköter, Mahamori, Beertainment, Jenescu, Anti-X, Sascha Müller, Cunningham, Oistress. Thanks to all. This wouldn't be possible without them.